So I have the pleasure and the honor to be joined by Wilfred Reilly. He is a political scientist and he is the assistant or associate professor at Kentucky State University. And as a public intellectual, he writes about crime and race relations issues. How are you, Wilfred?
Doing pretty well right now. This is my first interview of the day, so I got back from a run, and I'm looking forward to talking.
Nice. Yeah. I should like to begin by asking you about an organization which you were and are involved in, called
Right.
the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, FAIR. I've looked into the outfit, the organization quite a bit, and it's a really fascinating work that you guys are doing. So can you tell us about what the organization is about and the work that you do there?
Sure. So FAIR, as you said, that's the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, has a really simple mission, or a really simple mission statement, I guess, and that is that we oppose traditional racism totally, bias against Blacks or East Asians in the United States, anything like that. But we also oppose what you could call modern woke racism. The idea that the entire system is institutionally prejudiced and set up to oppress Black people. I mean, as you probably know, the most successful groups in the USA, Chinese Americans, Nigerian Americans, so on, are almost entirely minorities, Indian Americans. We object to sort of ritual humiliations forced on, white countrymen or males, the quote unquote privilege walk, where you're required to announce all of the sources of guilt in your own life, cultural revolution style. It's becoming very common in business. It's like a 6-hour training. It's unbelievable to watch. We oppose things like affirmative action policy so intense that in fact what you're doing is taking Asian students or East Indian students at university and cutting their numbers by half and saying, well, what we're doing here is achieving diversity because there are more Blacks or more poor whites or whatever that get in. That's an open form of discrimination. I'm not sure how it's constitutional. I think the court will soon say that it is not here in the USA. So we oppose bigotry in general. I mean, if you have a policy that says we want so many Blacks, so many whites, so many Asians, and so many Hispanics, regardless of qualifications, that would be a racist policy in most cases. And this strikes me as sort of the clearest kind of common sense, that you can't discriminate based on race. You can't humiliate groups of people based on race. You can't have just a very simple example, last sentence, but you can't have segregated student dormitories. This is something that's now being asked for primarily by Black students. So if you build a new building on campus, there would be claims that this should be minority student housing only or gay student housing only. And these are in general kind of the nicest residences. We oppose segregation. I didn't think this is something that would be taking me into the spotlight, really opposing racial segregation, but apparently there's a considerable lobby for it in the USA. But that's fair. Bigotry is bad.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
Yeah. So to prepare for this particular interview, I listened to the one that you did on the Fair Perspectives podcast with Melissa Chen and Angel Eduardo, in which, of course, you were very witty and brilliant. And yeah, to speak a bit on the topic, I've been going through Clarence Thomas's autobiography, the audio version, so you could get to hear the justice's voice. And he was talking about how in his 20s, after legalized segregation was struck down, there were a lot of campus radicals, Black students, who were looking to build like a faculty dorm exclusively for Black students, and later on there would be advocates for Black studies and African studies and such. So one must wonder, how is this so? Why is after the most humiliating set of policies ever be instituted in the US against Black people who are struck down, why do certain factions of say Black academia and activism wishes to bring it back?
Yeah, I mean, to me, again, as an executive for FAIR, or a member of their leadership team, whatever the technical title would be, I mean, yeah, that's a baffling question. So it's good to see that you a younger scholar, also opposed segregation. I didn't think this would be particularly controversial. You know, I'm against crime. I mean, we're at the level of jokes here, but I think there's a complex reality behind what you're saying. I mean, you have to be willing to honestly discuss affirmative action. So one of the problems in American universities is that when we integrated, and I think this is because of past oppression. I mean, I'm a culturalist, as the term is on IQ. I mean, I think obviously Nigerian Americans don't seem to have any problem in American institutions, but because of past oppression, past racial conflict in this country, Black students and also other groups, women who'd been prepared in perhaps a home economics curriculum at that point, you're talking about the 1960s, were simply underperforming in college. And the demand for ethnic studies majors, and to a lesser extent, women's studies majors, women adjusted fairly quickly, but came out of that. The idea was that we're here now, but we're not fully part of the institution. There's still racism on both sides. We're still 10% perhaps behind on average on the test. So we want a sort of enclave where we can develop and train to compete. And that was the original argument. At this point, you're talking about like 1963, if you read Clarence Thomas's autobiography and so on down the line. But that was the initial impetus behind the demand for example, a Black men's dorm, a Black studies field. And there was a lot of discussion of this in the Black community. Again, there's not a monolithic Black perspective in the USA, as you would think from watching our mainstream television networks, CNN, MSNBC, and the like. I mean, even at this point, people like, I believe it was Bayard Rustin said that we don't want Black students majoring in quote unquote soul courses that they can pass easily. I mean, if they have to study a little more than white kids to get a degree in economics, if they have to make up a gap, then they better make up the gap so they have a useful degree and they can contribute to society. But that was one side of the perspective. And unfortunately, with the aid of white radical faculty, this perspective was defeated. Black studies was established at almost every university, and this became part of a whole series of these fields. I mean, an Ivy League or Big Ten level institution now would have post-colonial studies, probably something in the Hispanic space, Black studies, women's studies. And then you'd have sort of radical or captured in many cases departments of things like sociology, some of the different qualitative studies. So there's quite a large sector you can go into. And obviously there are many brilliant sociologists so on, but there's quite a large sector you can go into where you're very often guaranteed of getting a degree in, for example, DEI focused human resources is something that comes to mind. And you might not have learned a great deal during that process, but the initial idea of kind of localized segregation was to give Black students a chance to compete and to be different in the institution. But unfortunately, when you set up incentives like that, if you've ever read Thomas Sowell on affirmative action, the book goes around the world. I mean, it goes into countries like Malaysia. It's well beyond the USA. But when you set up incentives for sort of rewarded non-competition, you get a lot of people that take advantage of them. So instead of Black students in many cases simply training to compete with white students, you have a disproportionate representation of minorities, women, political leftists, and so on in this cadre of fields that were set up for that purpose. And this is really, I mean, I'm friends with the sort of gadfly journalist Chris Rufo, for example, and this is really the DEI debate that's taking place right now, right? Like when these people get out of college, and by these people, I mean people with degrees in these fields, not the Negroes or something, but what are they going to do? I mean, in a typical big business, I've been a corporate executive. I mean, you're familiar with the fields. You have sales, marketing, engineering, IT. I mean, they're things that make the business run. What are you going to do with the degree in Black women's philosophy? And the answer seems to be that we're now creating similar fields in business. So you can go into HR, you can go into diversity. I mean, you can go into in college, perhaps admissions, Greek life. So all of this, in my mind, is kind of an infrastructure that comes out of the fact that we've made perhaps 10% of the academy this kind of resting place for people that want to be radical or that aren't, you know, up to par at the average for their institution. It's a weird phenomenon, but it's a real one.
Yeah, I'd like to pivot to the book that through which I was introduced to you and your work, which is Hate Crime Hoax, and which was published in 2019. I believe it was around the time Jussi Smollett, as he is known now, was exposed for his, racially charged antics. A lot has been said about Juicy Smollier, and most notably in that great Dave Chappelle special. But I like to go back in time to what I see as the first major case of a documented hate crime hoax, and that is the one of Tawanna Brawley. Uh, I remember in the film "Do the Right Thing" by Spike Lee, which is a great picture. There was a graffiti in one of the frames that says, "Well, Tawanna told the truth." And the more I read into it, the more I find that she may have totally fabricated the whole thing. And is well, the case of Tawanna Brawley is known today as the one that launched one Reverend Al Sharpton onto the public sphere. So, can you tell us more about the case? What was it? What was the background of it? And what were the facts and what were the claims and how they compare and contrast?
Sure. So the Tawanna Brawley case, as you say, is kind of the first major nationally known example of a hate crime hoax. And I mean, this was a case very late 80s, if I recall correctly, in Wappinger Falls, New York, which is a working to middle class suburb of NYC, where a young woman was found just horribly abused lying in the street. I mean, she had what looked like blonde hairs on her face. She'd been covered with what seemed to be human shit, bluntly. She'd looked like she'd taken a light beating, and she was sort of muttering to herself. She was unable to talk. And she was taken into custody. And she described this, especially after the Reverend Al got involved, remarkable in the literal sense, series of events. She claimed she'd been taken to the woods by a group of white men. Some of them were wearing coats and ties, if I recall. One of them was described as a police officer. I'm not sure how you'd be able to identify that. But they raped her vaginally and anally, I believe. They beat her, and so on down the line. It was just an awful story. And this obviously became front page national news. Like, uniformed cops are raping Black women in the woods. What are we? And you had the usual breastfeeding kind of hair shirting at the New York Times. This is America. Mm-hmm. And it turned out, unsurprisingly, this was a lie. There was no, if you actually have been subjected to an experience like this, if you've been captured in war or something like that, there's a considerable amount of physical and mental trauma, bruises below the skin, you're showing evidence of hypothermia and so on down the line. Brawley had none of that. And she also didn't seem to have had sex, which is, again, easily detectable by a simple kit or rape kit or intercourse kit. And I don't think that as like a 15-year-old kid, I don't think she knew all of this. This is before the NCIS level of cop show. So they found out that nothing had happened, and stuff got entertaining. I mean, you can apparently analyze species by species. Dogs eat more meat and whey or whatever's in dog food than humans do. So the feces that was on her skin turned out to have come from a large dog in the neighborhood. The blonde hairs from a white person were the interior lining of a pair of Nikes if you ever open up the gum sole. And just on and on. And it became finally obvious. There was kind of a bold attempt to say, well, we don't know what happened here, for a little bit. And then most people started saying, look, okay, this is an obvious fake. And the case became archetypal because it was so nationally publicized. The immediate assumption was not just this person's telling the truth, but every detail of this is accurate. The police detectives are out there raping young Black women. And the entire thing collapsed. The Tawanna Brawley case appears in Hate Crime Hoax, which, as you mentioned, is my first large scale book. I mean, there's a small academic book before that. But very small. But I mean, the hate crime hoax takes a look at the fact that this wasn't a one-off phenomenon. I mean, for the book, I put together a set of, I believe, 409 case studies of these nationally reported incidents that turned out simply never to have happened. And I have a broader definition of hoax than some researchers use, but where a story that was nationally reported or reported in a very reputable regional publication, the LA or Chicago paper, for example, and that was universally attributed to hate, turned out to have been the hoax work of the victim, which was a great number of them, or to have never happened at all. I mean, the noose found prominently in front of a heavily Black college was just a rope hanging from a construction dolly, so on down the line. And I mean, the list of these includes a large number of the most prominent kind of stories of hate in the USA. I mean, so Juicy Smollier, I mean, you're shouting out to Dave Chappelle's labeling him as the mad Frenchman there. But I mean, Covington Catholic, for example, maybe more an incident than a crime, but I mean, one of the leading national stories for a week. Representative Thomas, this congresswoman who claimed that she was accosted at, a high-end grocery store and told to go back home. She's of course a Black American, and none of it ever happened. Duke Lacrosse, Wisconsin Parkside with the nooses all over the campus and the list of death threats sent to students. Kean College, a similar case, Goucher College. I mean, just so on down the line, Kansas State, where the claim was that the high-end vehicles were defaced with these horrible racial slurs. Air Force Academy, where I'll end with this one. It'd be easy to cite 20 off of the head, but where a general came to campus and made a speech about racial comedy that was so moving, people thought he should perhaps run for the Senate or the presidency. And again, it turned out that just nothing had ever happened. A couple of disaffected cadets had faked hate incidents. I'll go on the record. I think the HBCU bomb threats case is going to fall in this space. I mean, we heard recently that the people responsible, they'd been thought to be Klansmen or something like this. They're apparently a diverse group of quote unquote juveniles savvy with technology. So it seems like a couple of script kiddie hackers or football buddies were targeting, perhaps not even on racial grounds, these sort of affluent colleges in their area with jokes. And so I think very soon, I would count that as a hoax. There'll be some debate in the sort of academic literature, but I think very soon it's pretty likely we'll see that didn't happen. Last sentence, actually, but we had a similar case in Canada. The claim was that there was they'd found just sort of Nazi-style mass graves at what were called residential boarding schools for mostly Native American children. I guess the idea was that these kids had been placed into this vicious sort of typhoid-laden environment. They died, and people were just throwing them into the mud by the river. It's now turned out that they haven't found any bodies. It appears the disturbances under the ground that made them think of graves could as easily be tree roots as the planet warms. I doubt they'll ever find anything in that situation. So it can get almost comical, but many of the most high profile cases of racial conflict that we've seen, and I've listed at least 10, simply haven't turned out to be true. And I thought that was interesting. I have no doubt the average fist fight between like a Black guy and a white guy at a country bar that happened. But why does the media keep running with these ridiculous campus stories, the University of Missouri, that just clearly aren't true? And why do people keep telling these lies? It's an interesting topic.
Yeah, it is. I was studying in Canada when the story of the mass graves, or so it seems, broke out, and there were a lot of discussions, and it leads to people canceling Canada Day, which was always kind of fun. And what struck me about Tawanna Brawley and the later cases, real or made up, involving Black people being brutalized in some ways, whether it's Madhu Diallo or Rodney King or Trayvon Martin, or most recently George Floyd, is that there's always a reaction in the mainstream, at least, where Black pundits who are more of the left liberal spectrum, they would always reach to this conclusion of, well, if it happens to one of us, it happens to all of us. And I think that is kind of the motto of Black Lives Matter. And over the years, it has propagated this notion that the country itself, the one that you live in and the one that I have never been to but admire very much, is tainted with racism in its DNA. And perhaps you can shed a light on this sort of collective mentality of how this came to be.
Well, some of this is just straight down the line social science work. I mean, there's a characteristic known as linked fate, which is essentially a quantitative representation of how tied you believe your fate to be to your group's fate. I use this in my dissertation, use it in a paper that I'm prepping right now. And I mean, it's a very measurable empirical thing. What we find is that for Blacks, there's a considerably higher level of linked fate than there is among whites in America or in Canada. I mean, I think the reason for that is obvious. I would suspect, I don't know how much this has been done, but if you did these surveys among Jews, natives, probably Irishmen until recently, you'd find the same thing. But yeah, there's a collective mentality that's often expressed by Black Americans. I mean, even the label "my brother" as a casual description of another man kind of indicates that. The problem with this, I think, well, the characteristic itself, I don't necessarily view as all that unhealthy. I mean, if you're talking about a minority potential business community in a country, that could be very useful. I mean, the overseas Chinese in Indonesia, for example, would probably have a fairly high level of linked fate. I mean, they're facing pretty considerable discrimination from the quote unquote Brahmiputri government. So, I mean, you essentially are going to get a job in small business if you're a member of that community there. And I would assume that there's kind of a quiet decision that you're going to patronize other small businesses in the community rather than, you know, large department stores owned by your ethnic rivals. We can talk about this morally, but that itself is neither here nor there. But in the USA, I think one of the problems is that linked fate is tied to a perspective on the country that is wrong. This is a real issue in the Black community that needs to be honestly discussed. I mean, the Black American philosophy, to a large extent, has been shaped by an understanding of past historical conflict with white people, which included oppression. I mean, we lost. Black people were 12% of the US population. So, I mean, Black conversation, at least at the academic level, is suffused with discussions of, you know, the great Tulsa, and I'm great in the sense of large, Tulsa race riot of 1920. I mean, segregation in the Deep South, which endured through 1954, so on down the line, lynchings. I mean, there were lynchings until the 1940s with some frequency. But most of this doesn't strike me as having a whole lot to do with what's going on in society today. So, I mean, for example, when you mention things like George Floyd, the killing of George Floyd, I mean, some terrible abusive policing there. Now, they're actually even there. If you're being honest, there's a dialogue that needs to be had. Like, was it the knee on Mr. Floyd's neck or back that killed him, or that would have killed him absent severe chemical intoxication? I mean, as it turns out, he was on both, well, I think it was heroin and methamphetamine, fentanyl and methamphetamine. So, I mean, like, there's a dialogue that we really need to have, even in cases where there clearly was fault, as whether these brutal murders are intentional or are frequently occurring. But, like, moving to the broader picture, the take on George Floyd was, I could be George Floyd. I heard this often from Black professionals that I know. You know, there's a wave of this police violence against Black men in this country. This country hasn't changed since 1950. And that just empirically is not true. I mean, if you go to the Washington Post database of Accounted and just look at how many people are killed by police in a typical year, you find actually fairly reassuring things. The total number of people shot by cops in a typical year is under 1,000. Perhaps 250 of them, maybe a few less, are identified as Black. You know, I mean, and again, there's some overrepresentation there, and you can argue about whether that's due to racism or to higher crime rates, bluntly. That's a legitimate conversation. But 70 to 75% of the people that are killed by police are Caucasian, whites, or Hispanics. And this is simply never discussed. It doesn't fit the narrative. It's tossed under the bus. But if you're looking at unarmed individuals shot by cops, they're well under 100, and typical year, maybe 18 to 20 of them will be Black. So that is the actual picture. There are 3 to 4 million deaths a year in a country the size of the United States, especially during the COVID era. There are roughly 20,000 murders a year. We have a fairly high murder rate among both whites and Blacks, and it's considerably higher among Black Americans. And there are, again, 18 unarmed police shooting deaths of men. All police killings don't represent a much higher figure. So the idea that you're at that George Floyd level of risk in the USA as a Black person is simply not true. But a huge number of people believe it. And there's quant data on point for this, right? I mean, so the Skeptic Research Center, about a year back, asked a well-selected, we'd say large N sample of Americans, how many unarmed Black men they believe were killed by the police in a typical year. And among leftists, both white and Black, the average estimate was close to 10,000. It was like 34% of the respondents thought that it was about 1,000. 15% or so thought it was about 10,000. And almost 10% thought it was more than that. I mean, this was the majority of all respondents. Maybe the average would be closer to 1,000. But this is something people very confidently stated. Conservatives, on the other hand, knew how many police shooting deaths of Black people there were. But this is just a fascinating piece of work I mean, so people are overestimating this by about 2 orders of magnitude. Kind of getting to the point, I think that misrepresentation, misanalysis of the situation combined with linked fate is very dangerous, because you have a large group of people that really feel that they or we are unifying together against genocide. And if you say, well, no, there's no genocide, interracial crime is a tiny percentage of crime, and it's 80% black on white. If you just point out these facts, the easy assumption is that you're an apologist for genocide, because this can't be true, because if it was, you'd know it as an educated black businessman. So it's a really weird cycle. A lot of people sort of tamp down their voices in the black sort of upper middle class because they don't want to be accused of racism. This is true for both blacks and whites, actually. But what this means is that no one then is saying the things that are obviously true, which indicate there's not much racism, and so on down the line.
Yes. I've read a study also, which the average American was asked about the population of Blacks in their country. And of course, the actual figures shows that Blacks can constitute about like 12-13% of the population. But if you ask the average American, they would widely overestimate it in the realm of, say, 1/4 to 1/3 of the population. And of course, the idea that this happened to one of us, therefore it happens to all of us, I think it was legitimized by, Barack Obama, when he says that famous phrase, "If I had a son, he would look like Trayvon." And of course, I think of that Frank Ocean song where he says, "R.I.P. Trayvon, that N-word looked just like me." So let's go to your article, which was published on Commentary Magazine, titled "The New Definition of Racism." This was featured on the cover of the magazine's May issue. And the subheading was, "Can we find a way out of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood?" And I'm not sure if the decision to feature that subheading belongs to you or the publisher, John Podhoretz and Co. But yeah, I found it was rather strange at first. Why would Mr. Rogers be involved with, kind of woke racism? And that is until I reached the final paragraph. Ibram X. Kendi was born Ibram Henry Rogers. It is time we left Mr. Rogers' intellectual neighborhood and got back to consensus reality before the real meaning of the word, as in racism, becomes a cultural artifact. So for those who are not familiar with the ideas of Ibram Henry Rogers, or as we know him by now, Ibram X. Kendi, how would you relay his central thesis to, say, the unfamiliar crowd?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Ibram Kendi, I think, is, and I would say, unfortunately, without any mocking of the man, one of America's best known public intellectuals when it comes to this arena of race and racism. And he has a very specific definition of racism that's not at all what most people are used to, and that I think is badly flawed. But essentially, Kendi's core thesis is that there are only 2 possible explanations for a gap in performance between groups. One of them is inferiority. That's the term he used in an interview with, for example, Vox. And I mean, I've always gotten the impression he means genetic. Most people wouldn't describe a temporary cultural gap in performance. Whites don't study as well as Asians as genetic inferiority, but that's one option. The other option is some kind of deep, pervasive racism within systems, no matter how hidden or hard to find. He calls this racist policy. And I don't want to misrepresent him at all. I mean, perhaps he would view cultural differences as inferiority, but I would view that as an even more absurd perspective, frankly. The argument that there are no differences between the 96 census groups in America is not widely accepted, let's say, in political science. But just taking the clearest version of his theory, the options are inferiority and racism. So what he says is that if you don't want to believe in the absolute inferiority of groups, you have to believe that every group gap is caused by racism. So his definition of racism is any policy that produces a performance gap between American groups. And his solution to racism is what he calls anti-racism, which is mandatory equity policies to ensure proportional representation of American groups in every sector, regardless of performance. So that's the Ibram Kendi definition of racism. And what I point out, and I've liked Kendi personally, I mean, I've encountered him on Twitter and so on, but what I point out is that this is, speaking frankly, just nonsense. Thomas Sowell, Amy Chua, Heather McDonald, Walter Williams, Glenn Lowry, June O'Neill, dozens really of quantitative social scientists have pointed out that large groups that vary in terms of big characteristics like race and sex tend to vary for regional, cultural, and in the second case, genetic reasons along dozens of other trend lines. So, I mean, just to pick like the least controversial, the most common age of a white guy, a white American male in the USA is 58. For a Black person, it's 27. For a Hispanic person, it's 11. I mean, Hispanics are a younger immigrant community. So when you look at how much wealth, for example, someone has, because you're a household as soon as you reach 18, you're an independent single individual, then hopefully you're a married man and so on down the line. But if you look at how much wealth a household has, it's obviously relevant whether the head of household is 18, because an 11-year-old wouldn't count, 27 or 58. I mean, it's just asinine to act as though this is not the case and we're seeing some holdover from the redlining policies of the past. Another variable, to some extent we are, like even among 58-year-olds, there's still some difference, but a great deal of the gap has been closed, let's say. Another obvious variable is residency in the South. I mean, as people in most nations know, I mean, the US South is sort of the formerly feudal Confederacy. It's the white regions, Appalachia and so on, are as poor as any of the rest of the region. Incomes have traditionally been a lot lower. They're still substantially lower. I mean, 10% or more below the national average in many states, Mississippi. So if you're looking at income or wealth, that's another variable. 50% of Blacks as versus 15 or so percent of whites live in the South. I would assume the majority of Hispanics still live in the Southwest, which is another traditionally impoverished region of the country, Arizona, New Mexico, so on. So like just adjusting for those things, and then bluntly test scores, which is something that still differs among different groups. I mean, that 3-point analysis closes a great deal of almost all of the gap between whites, Blacks, and Asians in terms of performance. So the argument that it's either this deep set inferiority or racism that causes group differences, and we haven't even gotten into deep culture, like how much test scores linked to study time, which has been documented over and over again by people like John Ogbu. But the argument that it's one or the other is just false. So once you accept that, the rest of the Kendi definition sort of falls apart. I mean, if you're arguing that the only reason for Hispanic underrepresentation in the NBA is bigotry, and then someone points out that Black and Balto-Slavic people tend on average to be 7 inches taller or whatever it is than Hispanic males, you've just answered the question. There's no more to be debated. I will say the best one-on-one basketball players I've ever seen are Filipino. The problem is that Pinoy guys, if that's a polite term for all groups to use, Filipino cats, tend to be about 5'6". So, I mean, like you'd have to raise the hoop for them really to compete against the best white or Black athletes. They're excellent, incredible handle with the ball, so on, but you're talking about a smaller population group. Samoans, on the other hand, in my experience, don't have the same graceful agility with, the old round ball, but are heavily represented in professional athletics because they tend to be very big. So, and this is awkward because this is one of those traits that might have a substantial genetic component, by the way. I mean, so when you get into athleticism, I mean, most people notice that there are groups of people, whites from the former Viking area, Black West Africans, Polynesian Islanders that tend to be big dogs you might not want to get in a fight with. So that's going to play a role if you're talking about who's going to be playing some football or who's going to be boxing. Anyway, once you adjust for all of this stuff, and I mean, for example, between men and women, there's obviously a difference in aggression. When people say there are fewer female military officers or in-court trial lawyers or combat instructors, I think every day-to-day intelligent guy on a basketball court or a golf course knows why that is. It's just become very awkward to say it. But all this stuff has to be said if we're talking about something like revamping the American business community. And I mean, the piece makes a start on saying it. So against the Kendi definition, I propose just using the definition of racism that was absolutely conventional until about 2019. I mean, racism is genetically based bias against another race. I mean, generally the racist is someone who A, dislikes someone because B, he thinks he is superior to them. That's it. That's what a racist is. If you don't like Japanese people and you think that the reason is that they're sneaky Eastern devils, something both whites and other East Asians have been known to say, then you're a bigot. I mean, I don't think that we need to go far beyond that into the realm of this sort of bizarre philosophy, like what could cause human groups to differ. I mean, that's at or above even my pay grade now, but it doesn't have anything to do with racism, fortunately.
Yes. Yeah, for all accounts, Kennedy, along with his counterparts, Robert DiAngelo and Nicole Hannah-Jones, very successful people. And the reason I think they are successful is that they dish out very simple answers to very complex sociological problems. And to play devil's advocate, so I haven't been to America, but my dad has been. He went to Baltimore, Maryland, and he got a very negative impression because he saw the wide disparity between, say, the white neighborhood, which was middle class and with picket fence and nice houses, and the black neighborhood, if you can call it that, where people basically live in squalor and with basically minimal income and wealth. And I would assume that many people who are outside of America would think that, and those inside of America would think that too, is that they may believe that white people, or the majority of white people that they meet, do not harbor any prejudices against them or members of any other race, but they get the sense that somehow the economic system or the sociological system is stacked up against African Americans or American Blacks. Well, there's historically, for a good amount of America's history, that has been the case legally and, well, socially. So they come to the conclusion that, well, maybe there's something that's stacked up. Maybe the system is stacked up against African Americans in ways that are implicit to everyone's knowledge or recognition or cognition. And if you've read, was it Robert Carroll's biography of Robert Moses, you see how this one guy who was in charge of the Parks and Recreations Department of New York has managed to shape the city to implicitly favor whites than blacks. And there are certain tactics such as, building factories or junk yards, scrap yards that are close to neighborhoods where Black people or newly immigrant communities live. So how would you answer to this particular set of way of thinking that is not particular Kennedy's, but would find Kennedy's explanation appealing?
You can come by and get it. Sorry, I'm talking to someone else. I might stop the video for a second so someone can walk by. I can just do it on my end.
Okay.
Let me. I assume this will be cut out. How would I respond to this sort of sweeping claim? Now, this I think is a more coherent systemic racism claim, but I mean, we have to look at this at a couple levels. The question of systemic racism, I think, is, are the gaps you're seeing due to racism today? I mean, that's almost a simplistic question, but I don't think anyone would deny that there's a wealth gap between Blacks and whites in the USA today. Although if you take all Blacks and all whites into account, if you throw in Appalachia, where there aren't any Black people, which is far more rundown in many areas than any neighborhood of New York City, and you remove the top 10% of earners, I mean, the gap is not especially large, but no one denies it exists. The question, though, is that due to racial bias right now? And I think that this, again, is a tough question for people to engage with honestly because of what you could call the specter of potential inferiority. So, I mean, what Kendi's saying is so dangerous. It's so intimidating to people because his argument basically is, if you break it down as a debater, if you disagree with me, you're a racist. So the two possibilities are inferiority and racism. Well, I don't think it's racism. Well, then do you think it's inferiority? That's the comeback. Now, other trained social scientists like myself will pull out a book and say, well, no, it's all these other variables that you put in your Stata model, my guy. But most people don't have the training to do that. So you're caught in this what a Kafka trap. You know, if you say, well, I'm not racially fragile, I have a lot of Black buddies, I have a Black husband, I just think there's a lot of excuse making going on right now. The response is going to be, well, that's something a racist would say. So it's the same thing when you're looking at the poverty in a Black Baltimore community. Do you think Black people are inferior? No. Well, then why are they so poor? And the default answer is supposed to be racism. I think that there are a lot of other obvious responses to that again, though. So I guess my response to this sort of thing would always just be, why don't you actually read the literature and look at the other variables that are involved here? And if you know how to, because most of the people discussing this are going to be junior academics or journalists, why don't you just break out Stata on your computer and take a look yourself? I mean, most of this is on the Census Bureau website, right? So, I mean, in Baltimore, I think my response would be, the problem with a purely racism-based argument is really threefold. Like, one, most of these problems didn't exist when ethnic conflict was much worse. Two, most of them don't exist for Black or Asian immigrants today. And three, all of them do exist for poor whites. So, I mean, first, in the 1940s and 50s, segregation was awful, it's terrible, but Black neighborhoods were in general relatively stable. I mean, when Walter Williams looked at this 1938, just prior to World War II, the Black illegitimacy rate, fatherlessness rate, if you prefer, was around 10%. And whites were doing even better, it's like 5%. But that's one of those kind of things between countrymen where, I mean, you might note the edge one group has or something like that, but there's no problem with fatherlessness. I mean, if you go to either an Irish or Italian or Black neighborhood in Baltimore then, despite the abuse all three of those groups were then taking, I mean, I assume you'd find well-kept brownstones and so on. I mean, we've all seen images from the area, the family standing in front of their new Studebaker, whatever color they were. So when you look at what destroyed urban Black communities, you have to talk about a series of variables that don't have a whole lot to do with racism. One is the implementation of mass welfare. So, I mean, if you look at what happened in the USA, we don't have a long tradition of the dole like some European countries do. So the Cloward-Piven welfare strategy in the United States began in the mid-1960s. And in a remarkably short period of time, by maybe 1979, you had seen fatherlessness rise among Blacks to something like 40%. And this is because of specific provisions in the welfare policy, which was kind of sexist on both ends. You couldn't get the check, as it's often called, if you had a man in the house. And people would come around, they'd look for boots under the bed and this kind of thing. I mean, you wear your boots to work. So the working guys who are in relationships with working class women, which can often be enjoyable and often leads to marriage, were kicked out of those relationships. You just had an entire neighborhood full of working class women. Then you made the neighborhood vertical. You built the housing project. And all of this was done. I mean, most of this was done by Black or ethnic white urban leaders. I mean, like if you look at Detroit in the 1970s, they didn't have a Southern Klansman as mayor. I think they had Coleman Hughes as mayor by that point. So, I mean, that's the actual reality, that you had welfare policy come in, you had outsourcing come in, and this is what destroyed Black neighborhoods. The initial gap in performance between a neighborhood of Black people and a neighborhood of Irishmen, 10% or whatever it was, sure, that's racism. Like, no one disputes that. But the destruction of the Black neighborhoods by modern social policy, that's something entirely different. Another thing I would say is, if you want to test whether this is due to racism, you need a control group. So you need to look at what happened to white people who at the start of this process, the start of welfare, outsourcing, the later waves of feminism, so on, were as poor as Blacks, and see if they're doing any better. And I can tell you, living in urban Kentucky, they are not. I mean, so there tends to be a lot of focus on Blacks as people in poverty because Black people live in cities. It really is that simple. I mean, you can take the news crew down to the projects and see what's going on. You can film a little kid just chewing on a bubblegum wrapper and that kind of thing. In Appalachia, in Arkansas, in West Texas, in the areas of concentrated white poverty in the USA, the non-native portion of New Mexico, there aren't a lot of cameras around, but you see the same stuff. I mean, the illegitimacy rate among whites just rose past 36%. Among poor whites, it's over 50%. So if you're trying to say, well, this problem among blacks is due to racism, you have to show almost by definition that the same problem doesn't exist among white people. And if you show that the same problem exists among white people, and there's just the residual 10-point gap that existed at the start, you can say, well, okay, 10% of this is due to past racism. The rest is due to social policy, and very little of it is due to racism now, which is sort of a commonsensical way of looking at it. I mean, last sentence here, but one thing that I would recommend academics do, scholars do, is flip the question. Of course, some people have already done this. But I mean, when I'm looking at racism, I guess my question would be, if you're a young guy who came here from a stable minority state, let's say Ghana or Thailand, and you are applying to college at Stanford, a good representative school, are you more or less likely to get in than a white guy? Well, maybe make both of the minorities black, because the Thai guy now would face some trouble if he was shoved into the Asian category. But I mean, if you are an immigrant from Ghana, middle-class family, stable country, are you going to be treated any differently from an immigrant from Albania? I mean, are you going to be less likely to get into college? You're going to be less likely to get into prep school? Are you going to be less likely to be hired by a Fortune 500 company? No. If anything, you're going to have a 5 to 10% advantage during almost all these exchanges. I don't deny that there are going to be situations where you might encounter lower end residual white racism, getting your car serviced or something like that, but you're not going to have an extraordinary amount of trouble in life. So that's the flip of the question if you're looking at racism today. Should we fix, the harms of the past? Yes, but even many of those are not due to racism.
Yes. What seems fascinating to me at the onset of the George Floyd shooting, not shooting, not killing,
Yeah.
is that the Black Lives Matter has somehow sparked protests all around the world, even in countries where, well, Black people are almost non-existent, where Black people are the majority, or where especially in England, where certain was it unarmed Black people are killed by armed cops. It does not exist because in Britain, cops do not arm themselves. But I think the a reason why it has sparked this worldwide phenomenon is that even though other countries in the world do not share the sociological experience and the history of the US of A, the experience of being brutalized by police or being treated badly by, well, less than, corrupt cops is almost universal. And even though the race element of Black Lives Matter may not be as rationally sound as one would thought, there's the police brutality. There's the fact that certain people in American society are more likely to be roughed up, brutalized, mistreated, and in some case even fatally killed by the cops. And I'm reminded of that Coleman Hughes line in that song. You're talking about Floyd, but you're not talking about Timpa, referring to Tony Timpa, who suffered the similar treatment under the police. So there's a major problem there of a certain class of people being brutalized by cops. So what do you suggest would be practical solutions to first address the problem and, well, to rethink crime in ways that is not, well, race-based?
Well, I think that police brutal violence is honestly a relatively minor problem in the USA. Like, I've traveled overseas, and in Latin America, I mean, people use the term la mordita, the little bite, to describe the government just kind of screwing with you. Like, if you're an adult fighting man and you have some money, they're fine with you, but like, you're still gonna have to pay for things. If you're stopped by the cops, I mean, in one situation, a friend of mine, this was in Nicaragua, I think, I wasn't with him, but he was stopped by the police for driving drunk, and he bribed the cop with a bottle of alcohol, and the cop left. I mean, and that's a very typical experience if you are down to have fun and you've traveled in different regions of the world. So in the United States, I actually don't think we have this level of issue with policing. Again, the total number of unarmed people killed by the police in a typical year is 20. I mean, we do have a higher rate of overall police killing than many states, but that's also because our population is something like the 4th largest in the world and everyone has a gun. I mean, so again, when you put 3 variables into your Stata model, it's not that hard to predict what's going on there. But how would you reduce the police violence that does happen? By the way, before I go into this, I will say I agree with you. It's absolutely hilarious, for want of a better word, to see Black Lives Matter marches in places like Norway and South Korea. I mean, like you have to ask, are there any? I mean, they had one in South Africa. And I mean, the entire country is run by Black people, and the whites are now claiming they're oppressed. So I mean, it would just annoy me if I were a white guy who just lost the race war. I mean, exaggerating only slightly, sit there in my house and watch people march by chanting Black Lives Matter. It's like, well, we know you guys are in charge now. You know, I mean, so it's just, there. Of course, it doesn't make any sense. But, you know, the basic idea of what should you do with corrupt policing, I mean, again, the answer is a lot more complicated than the stupid stuff you're going to get out of kind of the DEI block we were talking about earlier, like more training and sensitivity. I mean, your job is running around in the street putting asses in jail. Like, you're just going to sit through that training, laugh, and then go back to putting asses in jail. If you really want to regulate police, you're going to have to get at a lot of the institutional structures of the public sector, which actually is really corrupt in America. I mean, we're probably the most crooked large country. When you see some of these political scandals, even the legal stuff, like every year, there's a Twitter account called Nancy Pelosi Stock Tracker that just follows all Nancy Pelosi's buys. I've actually bought based on the advice of this account, although I don't necessarily recommend it. But it's just like our politicians, you know what's going on behind the doors. They're all trading at 15 times the success rate of the market and so on. So like, if you really want to get at that kind of corruption, even at the lower municipal level, I mean, I think you're gonna have to do something about qualified immunity, which is basically the idea that you as a police officer have more legal protections than an average citizen. Your union's gonna protect you no matter what you do. I might get rid of the police unions, although Black Lives Matter has become so unfair, as Me Too did, when it comes to what allegations they'll bring, that I don't think that's practical. But you've got to weaken public sector unions, which are odd and corrupt in general. Because if you work in the public sector, you're negotiating with yourself. I mean, if you're a cop, the entity that pays you is the municipal government. So your boss can sit down with people that they interact with on an almost daily basis, the overall police commandant, the local congressman, and negotiate something like a payment issue in exchange basically for votes. So I'm not a huge fan of public sector unions in the first place, so that wasn't my best explanation ever of why. But some weakening of police unions, take a look at qualified immunity. Another more practical thing would just be drum bad officers off the force. I mean, that's really what I'd focus on. I mean, if you look at the first two are possible, the first two are suggestions that the left should want. I think on the right, which is where I fall in the US, I'm on the center right. But we should sort of say the issue here is that X% of the officers are responsible for Y% of the brutality complaints. So if someone gets more than a certain number of brutality complaints, let's stop screwing around with the union, get this guy out of the force, or put him on a total desk job. He can clean guns when they come back in. I mean, that is, I think, the practical solution. But again, the reality is that there's not a massive problem with police brutality. Like when Roland Fryer, great Black academic, teaches at Harvard, when he looked at this, he found that before the full set of his variables went into the model, I will note, but there was a 16% difference in sort of rude talk or handcuffing between Black suspects and white suspects, which is what all the media outlets in the USA chose to focus on. However, there also was a 27% difference in terms of who got shot in favor, if that's the term, of white suspects. Like white guys were more likely to be shot with everything else equalized. There's some papers that have challenged this since, but I find it just an absolutely facially plausible result. That if you're chasing a Black guy in the BLM era, you might speed up and catch him, knowing that if you shoot him in the back, your career is over. There are going to be marches, there are going to be riots. If it's a poor white guy or a Hispanic guy, I mean, there's no consequence for that at all, unfortunately. And humans are predatory animals. I mean, we act based on incentives. So the one paper that I think is the best that's really on point found, a 20% edge for group A over here and a 20% edge for group B over here. So you'd really have to show me empirically that any of this stuff is going on today, not in 1964. And I think that's the big issue. Get corrupt cops off the force. We all agree on that. But there really aren't a huge number of corrupt cops. Like there are a bunch of cops that might curse at you and they arrest you or slap you upside the head if you're charged with felony or something. And we, of course, don't approve of that. But the idea that people are out there murdering Black men is simply not real. And it probably hasn't been real for 70 or 80 years.
Yes. Around the first few months, I actually came to the same conclusion, and you might be glad to know that I'm sort of on the center right as well, where, the more I read about it, the more I thought that, the police unions were collaborating with the state and local police department, was dealing with bad cops the same way the Catholic Church deals with bad priests, just quietly send them away to a different precinct. So 2 final questions, since we are running out of time. One has to do with hip hop music, since this is a music show. I'm a fan of hip hop. I would assume that you are as well. 2 things. While one can appreciate the lyrical master skills of the top MCs, we should be wary of some of the lyrical contents that was featured in the songs. I mean, there's a lot of there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of sexism. There used to be a lot of racism. I mean, Ice Cube's songs are like filled with anti-Semitic lyrics at one point. And of course, the great distrust of cops and at some point white people. And if you listen to, I don't know, Lupe Fiasco, the American credo as a whole. So how can we have this conversation on hip hop without being labeled as, I don't know, tip of war, or some kind of like racist suburban mom who doesn't let her kids listen to Eminem or such?
Yeah, I think that, in terms of hip hop is interesting because hip hop has gotten a complete pass from almost all of the censors in society. I mean, when you look at Me Too, when you look at what Dave Chappelle called the rainbow people, like the very active gay and trans movement, so on, when you look at like the pro-Black folks that'll criticize anyone who criticizes Black people, I mean, like you can have a record by 2 rappers who are literally named Black Criminal and the Arab Assassin called like Bitch Killer. And everyone's just like, oh, that's great, dancing along to it. It is entertaining. I personally think that as an adult, there's a substantial space for being quote unquote bad, or a female friend might put it as naughty. Like I spend a substantial portion of my days training to kill people. I mean, going to the gun range. Sex is obviously fun. It's a key part of life. If you go to the gym, you're going to listen to loud music about fighting other men. Mostly it's going to be metal, hip hop, punk. I mean, I think there's a perfect place for that if you're an adult. The real problem with hip hop is that young fatherless kids think these dudes are telling the truth. Like I remember listening to hip hop. I was never a drug dealer, but I grew up in a tough neighborhood and I was very active in kind of the rave scene. Like I'd be my buddies through events and so on. And like, I actually know how much drugs weigh and like what they cost. And rappers are almost always wrong. So like, I remember when Young Jeezy started referring to himself as Mr. 17.5, implying that he was buying kilos of pure cocaine for 17,000. And it was like, no, you're not. Like, it's just not a thing that happens. Do you live near water? Like this, why are you lying like this? But I think that when people who are not aware that this is unreal listen to this stuff, it is very, very problematic. I think though the issue is at a higher level because there's lots of music. Like I'm not defending hip hop. Hip hop's the most on this. Hip hop's the most profane. But like if you listen to like Narco Ranchero or metal from the Marilyn Manson era, like Lords of Acid or Cruella style dance pop where the songs have titles like Get Me Wet Again. I mean, like it's very similar content. The real issue is that this is coming down the pike at kids who aren't prepared to deal with it. So the real question is, how do you strengthen families, churches, if you're a religious guy, so on down the line? How do you, in the internet era, actually ensure that people are 18 when they buy this or they buy porn? I mean, I'd favor a basic ID upload system if the company's reputable, and blah, blah, blah. But the music itself, yeah, it's violent and it's mostly about sex. That's not bad if you're an adult. It is a little weird for the kids. That's the one thing. So I guess my first solution is just what I said. I mean, build up fatherhood. It's going to be a tough road, but that's a lot of things like violent video gaming, even moderate drug use are really only problematic if you have no structure in your life. So that providing that structure is what we need to do as a society. We're not actually going to ban Cruella records because they say vagina, let's say, lips in them. We're not going to come up with a series of words like they did in the 1980s that you can't use on a record probably. Yeah, that's that. Also, I have no hope for these institutions, but it would be nice if the people on the left, from the mainstream media to the censor organizations, were at all consistent. Like, I mean, if I have a recommendation for Me Too. I mean, a fair number of feminists hate follow me. You know, like, why don't you do something about songs with names like "Beat That Bitch"? Like, they're obviously like. I was listening to. I was watching the Memphis Grizzlies Golden State Warriors basketball game the other day, and they were actually playing the censored version of the 666 Mafia song "Beat That Bitch" from Hustle and Flow, and it was "Whoop That Trick." But it was like the lyrics are like, "Whoop that trick, beat that prostitute." And all these people in the audience were like waving towels and all this. And it was kind of like, it was insane to see these suburban white and black businesswomen doing this. Like, these are the same people that are like leading the sexual harassment trainings, you know, "Whoop that trick, whoop that trick." The audience is going crazy. So, I mean, I would like to see the groups that are supposed to have something to say about this, not young male fighters, but like the churches, Me Too, so on. I'd like to see them say the obvious. I guess that's my stopgap answer.
Yes. Okay. So final question. Can't believe this has been the most amusing podcast conversations I've had with an academic. So thank you for that.
Academics tend to be fairly dry. Like, I mean, I consider myself as good at nerdy wonkery as almost anybody, but I mean, I was a sales director before this job. And I mean, you have to be able to go out and talk to clients and drink scotch and so on. So I mean, hopefully some of it survived. Hey, little fella.
I hear that Roland Fryer is also like an exquisitely funny guy too. So final question. The opposite of what I find to be the hip hop ethos is represented by Thomas Sowell, which is mentioned at the beginning of this podcast. I've always found that after, having my mind blown by his books and arguments and hot takes, that I think liberals should read Thomas Sowell more. So which of his many books would you recommend to, say, a liberal friend who just heard of his name?
The book I'd recommend is The Vision of the Anointed, because that so perfectly describes what we're seeing in society today. Sowell's point, this book I think originally dates back to 1999, so he's talking about it as a possibility, and it absolutely came true. But his point is that during sort of the big sort era, we were moving toward a situation in which a very large number of the intelligentsia, which I would define as the people in media, the people in secondary education, the people in higher education, as you get older, make money. I mean, the people in the charities, the NGOs that run so much of adult social life, all of these people were sharing one vision that's extremely marginal in society overall, which he calls the vision of the anointed. But this is essentially the idea that humans are totally plastic, that race is not real, that sex is barely real, that major social change is easily possible in response to things like, frankly, a rather mild disease pandemic, COVID-19, which over 2.5 years killed about 1 million Americans. And that's mostly the second year because most of them chose not to be vaccinated. I mean, of course, terrible, but that social change in response to this sort of thing is extremely possible. It's quick. It has no negative externalities. You sort of shut down the country and then you go back to doing things normally and there'll be no inflation. Mr. Biden said this. I mean, so Tom Sowell points out that many people in the intelligentsia hold to this niche vision, which tends to be linked to ideas like Marxism, Foucauldianism before that, Rousseau's philosophy. And he provides considerable quantitative, exemplage of this in the book. And I think that right now we're in a position where the quote unquote anointed are utterly dominant, not overall, not, in law or something, but in discursive life in America, to the point where something like Fox News is considered extraordinarily hard right, for example. I mean, it's hard right for a media company, but I would say that Fox would be to the left of about 40% of the American population. I mean, you have a very significant you have very significant system control by this group. The I guess the main point to take from that book also is Soule's analysis of kind of the personality type, if you will, of the Anointed. One of the points he makes is that this tends to be a very anti-democratic group. The idea is that a certain block of smart people with elite secondary degrees should really make most decisions in society because they have the latest, most up-to-date knowledge. They've read the most recent paper in women's studies. And Soule's point is that a lot of the knowledge that these people have tends to be trendy, fashionable, very unlikely to have stood the test of time. Marxism, in fact, is an excellent example of this. And that there's much more knowledge contained among smart people like local elites in society who the state would generally be better served to listen to. So anyway, for those reasons and others, I'd recommend The Vision of the Anointed. His book on affirmative action worldwide is much more niche, but is probably the second I would recommend, simply because it illustrates that there are certain patterns of race relations in almost all countries, that allowing equal competition seems to be the best way for people to get along, that federalism works very well, as in Brazil, Indonesia, and racially diverse states, but that simply giving kind of unearned benefits creates this cycle where you get professional hucksters demanding more unearned benefits. I mean, everything, his lessons from, Zainichi Koreans in Japan or Black South Africans or something like that apply equally well to the USA, I think.
Oh, yeah. So with that being said, Wilfred Reilly, I thank you very much for appearing on this program. This has been a very insightful, thoughtful, and very funny conversation, unexpectedly. I wish you the best with all your work, and I hope you take care of yourself.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. Let's stay in touch and have a good day.
Yeah, you as well.